Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yes? No? Okay. I'm Leanne Irwin, and I'm a member of the Institute on World Affairs, and I welcome you all here this evening as part of our institute. I'd just like to remind you about tomorrow's program, which is called The Dilemmas of Freedom, and Consul General Alexander von Schmeling from the Federal Republic of Germany will be discussing challenges of international terrorism, as well as Dr. David Weisbrod, who will be talking about freedom and human rights in the foreseeable future. This evening's lecture, as you all know, is on the topic of why hungry in a world of plenty, which myself and I assume most of you are also interested in. I think that at this university, it's good to hear more than one side of this issue. We have tonight Frances Moore Lappé, who is from the Institute on Food and Development Policies, and she has currently just written a book called Food First, which is being translated into other languages, and she also wrote Diet for a Small Planet. So here she is, Frances Moore Lappé.
Thank you, Leanne. I see all these motions back there. Is it on? Is the microphone on? Okay. The way I like to begin a talk is to tell you a little bit about myself, because it puts me at ease. It's always easiest to talk about ourselves. And also, my other reason is that when I sit in an audience, I always want to know why in the world that person is up there. What led that person to think that they had something to share. And I'd like to do that take maybe 10 minutes to take you back a ways in my own life and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing now. In many ways, I describe myself as a classic child of the 1960s. I graduated from college, a small Quaker college in the Midwest, in 1966. And it was, I would say, the height of the period of anguish over the war in Vietnam, a period of extreme desperation for many, many people, particularly young people, trying to figure out what to do with our lives. The civil rights movement was very much alive also. And I did what people like Tom Hayden told us to do. We learned about grassroots organizing as a way to solve America's problems, and I went to Philadelphia and I worked with welfare rights organizing in the ghettos of Philadelphia. And it was a very desperate time. I'll repeat that word because for me it was the theme of my life then. I felt that if I couldn't help to solve America's problems in the next 5 or 10 years, that everything seemed lost. It did seem very desperate. But I did this grassroots organizing, but never felt very satisfied, because I knew that even if I succeeded every day in what I had set out to do, that I would not be really addressing the root causes of the suffering that was so evident to me. I knew that if I helped somebody get coal that night or get what they deserved from the welfare system, that really the forces that were causing their suffering would not be changed. But I went ahead doing what I was doing because I didn't know what else to do. And till a point that it got too uncomfortable. By that time I was a graduate student in community organizing in social work, graduate school in Berkeley. And I reached that point in my life, which I'm sure many of you have reached, where you project the rest of your life ahead on the current trajectory that you're on. And you realize that something is fundamentally amiss, that something basically wrong, and you can't do it anymore. So at that point, this was in late 1968, I decided that I would make a personal vow to myself that I would never do anything else again in community and political action until I understood why I had chosen one path as opposed to another. And to do that, I had to know something about the real forces, the root causes of the suffering that was so clear to me and is so clear to me. So that was probably the most difficult decision I ever made, and I was very uncomfortable because I was afraid that somebody might ask me what I did and I wouldn't have an answer. And so I stayed home a lot. I didn't even have children at that time, so I couldn't even say that I was a housewife. And I shouldn't have worried, though, as I look back, because in Berkeley in 1960s, nobody really asked you what you did. They might ask you what you were into. And the problem was I couldn't even tell them what I was into. So I stayed home a lot, and I read a lot on my own. For the first time, realized that I had innate interests, things that I had to figure out for myself. Then I discovered the Agricultural Library at Berkeley. It's a small library, which a basement library. Nobody much came to it, and there was a friendly librarian. And this is the time that I was beginning to focus in on food. Because I thought that if I could just understand why people were hungry in the world, that would give me a handle on the economic system as a whole. And I was reading books like The Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich's book that had exploded during that period, and Famine, 1975. So I was reading the popular literature about the fact that the human masses were impinging on a limited food supply, and this was going to be causing famine. I was also very much affected by the ecology movement, which very rightly said that we live in a finite world, and that influenced this prediction of famine due to scarcity. And I started auditing soil science courses and geography courses and trying to figure out some of these questions for myself. Till almost by accident, in that agricultural library, one day I ran across certain figures about U.S. agriculture. I learned, for example, that a large portion, half of our harvested acreage, is fed to livestock in this country, and then I went on to learn that a very small portion of that gets returned to us in meat. And then I went on to learn that actually we do very well without meat. Well, all that said to me was that here, on the one hand, I was reading about scarcity as the cause of hunger, and all the newspaper headlines and all the books I was reading were painting this race between food and people. And then on the other hand, I was reading the facts about just how land is used and realized that I was part of a system that because people couldn't make effective demand on that grain, that land was being used to feed livestock. So the two didn't quite fit together, and so I began to feel like the little boy in the fairy tale, the one who wants to say the emperor wears no clothes, but he's afraid to say that because he's afraid, well, it's so obvious, right? If somebody else would be saying it, so he had to be wrong. And that's really the way I felt. Even when Diet for a Small Planet was published, I felt very much that way, that I must be missing something. And of course, now this whole notion that livestock are an inefficient way to process humanly edible protein is pretty well known, but at that time it wasn't. And so I became, in 1971, well, let me just say that in writing that book, what I had hoped to do was to really focus on a case study of how economic givens determine how the land is used, and that the question then of world hunger is much more a question of the political and economic system than it is the question of how much grain is actually growing in the world. And those are the questions that I try to illustrate by focusing on the meat production in this country. But what happened in 1971, when Diet for a Small Planet was published, is that overnight I became the Julia Childs of the soybean circuit, as I sometimes describe it. And it wasn't a lot in life that I had exactly sought, because I was really thinking that I was going to be getting people to focus on the political and economic givens, whereas what happened is that I was invited to go on innumerable talk shows and stir the beans and rice, and if I brought my own, that is, and tell people how to save money and eat lower on the food chain. And all this is not to belittle the message of Diet for a Small Planet. I think that anything that we can do to bring our own consumption patterns of whatever we consume into the reality of what our bodies really need and the rational use of our land is a good step. It's just that it can be reduced to the very simplistic notion, as Hubert Humphrey said in 1974, that if we just ate a few less hamburgers a week, that this would provide food for the hungry world. And certainly that is a simplistic reduction. But I don't want you to think that I am belittling the book, but rather sharing the difficulty of having this door open to me as the author of Diet for a Small Planet. It was an opportunity to be on talk shows that people would be listening to and watching who would never read a book on the political and economic causes of hunger. So it represented an opportunity to reach out to average Americans, and yet it could also be demeaning. Here I was being put into the woman's slot on television as a cookbook writer. So it was a very difficult period of about 3 years in my life where I struggled with whether or not to go along with that. And for the most part, I did go along. I tried wherever possible to take advantage of these opportunities to explain what the message of the book was. And sometimes it was more difficult than others. Perhaps the most difficult one was, I remember Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1975, I think it was, I was asked to go on, I know it must have been about 1973, I was on a talk show late at night with a UFO expert. And they tried to find some common ground between Frances Moore Lappé and the UFO expert. And all they could think of was to ask me that night was, what do you think they eat on UFOs? And I had to go from that question to the political and economic causes of hunger. But that period of my life ended really in 1974 when I went to the World Food Conference in Rome. Many of you, I hope, remember that this conference, it was a time when global attention was focused on the fact that there are estimates, I'm sure conservative, of hundreds of millions of people who go to bed hungry every night. And this conference, convened through the auspices of the United Nations, a conference where government leaders were brought together from all over the world, and I might add also corporate leaders were also there in abundance. I went thinking that I would rub elbows with some experts, I would glean a new understanding, and I came away a very, very changed person in two ways. It's amazing what 1 week can do in one's life. I found that I went there pretty much in the framework that I just said, and I was shocked by two things. First, I was shocked by the fact that I was considered an expert. That was very unsettling. And number two, I was shocked that the people who were working in those committees in which I sat in were still working in the very old frameworks that I had already discarded for several years. So I came back from Rome with, I hope I never lose my humility. I hope that none of us ever do. But on the other hand, I came back with a renewed sense of commitment and a sense that I had to take my own work much, much more seriously. I guess that's what it boils down to. That I couldn't be allowed to be the Julia Childs of the soybean circuit any longer, that I had to do much more in-depth study on my own to understand these issues and communicate them to people I already had a platform that Diet for a Small Planet had given me. So what I ended up doing then when I came back from Rome is to revise Diet for a Small Planet and to launch the work on Food First, Beyond the Myth of Scarcity, and establish the Institute for Food and Development Policy. And so I won't forget it later on. There is a little brochure about the institute that I helped to found, and you can pick one up as you leave, and if they run out, please sign your name. There'll be a pad there, and if you would sign your name and address if you would like to receive publications from our institute. You will not be deluged, but you will be notified if of our upcoming publications. But let me just move from this introduction to the heart of my message tonight, because what we do at the Institute, and this is by way, my whole message here tonight is really communicating to you how we see our work at the Institute. It is one of trying to reach out to people from all walks of life in the United States. Our work has been printed in everything from People's Magazine to the Reader's Digest to, it's now being translated into Bengali. So we try to reach out to the broadest possible audience. We are not interested in debating in closed academic circles. We believe in our basic premises that the fundamental issue of hunger will not be solved by experts off in any elite institution. However, they will be solved as people like us, like you and me, learn that we can and we must take greater responsibility for our economic system. So that this is our outreach is a very broad one. And what we try to do, and what I'll try to do tonight, is lay out for you 4 of the most basic misunderstandings about the causes and solutions to hunger that we believe have a grip on many, many Americans, if not on you, I would say probably on your friends, your colleagues. And a lot of our work is to develop a language of communication, to break down the rigid isms that divide people, that make people fearful, to divide people, to break down the stereotypes of hopeless and hungry and passive people, and to begin to build the links between average people in the United States and people struggling for food security in the third world. So let me just review the 4 myths I'll be attacking. 1 is the myth of scarcity, that scarcity is the cause. 2 is the myth that production alone can solve the problem of hunger. 3 is the myth of that there is a them versus us contest, the rich versus the poor contest, in rich world versus poor world terms. And 4 is the idea that there is a conflict between justice and production, justice and feeding people. So those are very shorthand. They probably don't mean too much. But let me just explain, take each one to give you an idea of where I'm going. And I will also end with a section on what is the proper role of the United States citizen vis-a-vis global and domestic hunger. So let me just lay aside, first of all, the myth of scarcity. I won't dwell on it because I think that it is generally being discredited in many circles and not just, of course, in our own work. But let me give you a couple suggestions on how you might attack the myth of scarcity, people who believe somehow that there is not enough food to feed the world. Let me say that on a global basis, we estimate, based on UN statistics, that there are presently 3,000 calories produced just in grain for every man, woman, and child on Earth. That's not counting that's every year for every day, not counting all of the other fruits and vegetables and nuts and beans and everything else that people grow to eat, just in grain. But then, of course, one must look at the so-called hungry countries, the basket case countries. And so, because this is what matters, what is the potential? What is the actuality where people are hungry? So we have focused in our research on the supposed basket case countries, countries like Bangladesh, or the African Sahelian region, or India, for example, or countries that people think of as overpopulated and destitute. Well, what we discovered about Bangladesh is that it has some of the richest alluvial soils in the world, potential to not only grow enough food, even according to a U.S. congressional report and many other scientific studies, not only to feed itself, but to be a grain exporter. India, for example, which people associate rightly with chronic hunger, today has 18 to 22 million tons of grain. Some of this grain is reserve grain. Some of this is stacked up on World War II airstrips and covered with tarpaulin so that it will, because there's just not enough storage space. It is protected by soldiers so that hungry people won't eat it. This is in a country with chronic hunger. We found when we looked at the Sahelian region in Africa that even during the height of the drought in the earlier part of this decade, that an FAO report indicates that with possibly one exception, there was enough grain in each of the countries in this region to feed everyone there. We also discovered that there was an increase in exports of luxury crops to the European market during the height of famine and actual starvation in these countries. So these are some ways to attack the myth of scarcity. And in our work, we've had to conclude, therefore, that there is no such thing as a hopeless basket case. That in terms of the basic food needs of people for survival, every country in the world has the capacity to meet those needs. Now, the closely linked myth is the myth that, well, let's just put it this way. If scarcity is the cause of hunger, people automatically conclude, and they conclude this because we get this constantly through newspapers and all the mass media, that production will be the solution. In other words, that increases in the world grain production are equated with the solution to hunger, that breakthroughs in plant breeding, that breakthroughs like protein from petroleum or some other innovation is associated with the solution to hunger. Now, what we have done in our work is to try to separate the production focus from a necessary solution to hunger. We are not anti-production, we're not anti-technology. Rather, we are saying that unless the social structure is first addressed, then the introduction of new profit generating and production generating technologies can have the opposite effect from that which is intended. Let me just draw out for you some of the actual empirical results, empirical findings, studies that have now been concluded that have looked at countries throughout the world that have identified the problem as inadequate production and have set out to solve it through increasing production. This includes most market economy countries throughout the world. And there is a chain of events that is set into motion once agriculture becomes the new growth industry, once local governments, international lending agencies start focusing new credit possibilities into agriculture. Plant breeders focus attention on seeds that will have a higher yield if they're gotten the right fertilizers and pesticides and water. Once this process got underway, then quite naturally, those farmers who were able to take advantage of that new technology, those able primarily to get the credit that was necessary to purchase the new technology, were those able then to profit from it. What happened then is a process of increasing expansion of the average size of the land holding, the larger holders increasing the amount of land that they wanted to cultivate themselves because they saw it as more profitable than ever before, so that tenants were pushed off the land. As mechanization was subsidized, there was an increasing mechanization that meant fewer jobs in some areas, so that while at the same time there was an increasing number of landless, more than the natural rate of population growth, there was at the same time fewer jobs because of increased mechanization of agriculture. So that the effect then of the increasing concentration, the increasing landlessness, the increasing joblessness, is one could say that people were increasingly cut out of control over food-producing resources. And to be cut out of control, we have discovered, is to be cut out of consumption in many cases. When we traveled down to the heartland of the Green Revolution, the very birthplace of it in northwest Mexico several years ago, we saw this process going on. It was very, very visible. You could see that around the hub city of Hermosillo 20 years ago, the average acreage was about 400 acres. Today, the average acreage is about 2,000 acres. And this chain of events that I have described very schematically has been studied now by many organizations, and one recent study that we think is highly useful, completed by the International Labor Organization, looked at 7 countries that together comprised 70% of all people living in a non-socialist underdeveloped countries in the rural areas. And what they found was, well, it would be an ironic result if one had not understood this chain of events that I have described, but actually should have been quite predictable. what they have found is, yes, these new technologies, this introduction of the various great new emphasis on agricultural production has created more food grains per person in each of these countries, with possibly one exception. Yes, there is more per person, and yet there is more hunger for the bottom 20 to 80% of the people than before this process began. In other words, what the conclusions draw is actually not only an association but a causal relationship, that this very process of increasing production actually led to the increasing marginalization of people, so that while there could be more food produced, there is also greater hunger. So I would say that one message I want to leave with you tonight is that we have to face up to the fact, first, that things are getting worse. That even as we hear you read the development rhetoric is definitely more enlightened, and you see all what we call the appropriate terminology tumbling forth, the reality is worse as more and more people are being cut out of control over food producing resources. It was estimated that by a study done by the FAO in the 1960s, that in 83 countries studied, an average of a little over 3% of the landholders controlled about 80% of the land, and that concentration has been accelerated by this process that I have described to you. Now, I want to point out here, I want to make a little aside that I think fits in most naturally to this myth of production as the answer. And it may surprise you that I'm putting it under this heading, and what I'm going to do is draw out a few little sub-myths here. And I would like to put U.S. foreign assistance and World Bank strategies under the myth of production. Basically, that already tells you something about the kind of critique that I would make of the strategies of our U.S. government Agency for International Development and the World Bank. And I want to just point out maybe 5 little sub-myths here, because so often when people first discover that food and agriculture is not only the primary issue in terms of human survival, it is something that captures our imagination, because it ties in every aspect of the human social organization. And they want to do something when they discover the urgency of this issue. And so very often we find people coming to us and saying, well, isn't the appropriate role to work on improving U.S. foreign assistance and to try to reform it and make sure that it's focusing on small farmers and appropriate technology? And in fact, there has been a campaign like this very campaign for several years now, that has influenced congressional legislation having to do with U.S. foreign assistance. So I would like to state some of the conclusions that we have come to in trying to answer this question for ourselves, and in a way that hopefully will be useful to others. I would say that, first of all, I would ask you to always try to see AID and the World Bank, and I would basically put them in the same category in terms of the kinds of programs underway, although I think if you had to compare them, I think that AID would be better, but even still there's similarities. To get the big picture, we have to ask overall, on whose side do these organizations put their weight? Do they really help us ally ourselves with the poor majority in underdeveloped countries? Now, I'm going to make a very general statement to get you thinking about that question, and it's one that would need on your part, you couldn't take my word for it, but just to think about it for a moment, that as an arm of the United States government, and the World Bank is an arm of many national governments, and the U.S. has the major voting bloc in the World Bank, but as arms of the U.S. government, these organizations must work through the government in whatever underdeveloped country they're working. And the more we learn about the cause of hunger, the more we realize that the governments in many third world countries are a very powerful part of the obstacles in the way of people achieving food self-determination. They are not part of the solution, they are part of the obstacle in the way. So that reinforcing, giving credibility, for example, to the Marcos dictatorship, I think is a very good example, to the Somoza regime in Nicaragua. And we could go on and on into kinds of, to Indonesia and Thailand and Bangladesh. We could go on and list governments that are actively working to maintain the status quo in their countries, that U.S. aid then flowing into these countries in large volumes serves to reinforce that status quo. That is something that is often easy to forget when we focus in on an individual project of one of these agencies. So that's a very, very general statement I would just lay out as a challenge. But I would also point out that it is important to focus on the projects, on how the target population, the paramilitary terms are now very widely used in these circles, and so you hear about the target population. And the target population, we are told, is a small farmer. And you will read about this in World Bank literature and in AID literature. So we look at then projects that have this small farmer focus. Well, first of all, there has to be another question asked. Is the small farmer the real hungry majority in the third world? Focus on the small farmer totally neglects the fact that in many countries the landless make up the majority of hungry people in the countryside. They are the poorest people in the countryside, and they often make up 30, 60, in some cases 80% of the people in terms of effective landlessness, not enough land to even qualify as any kind of a small farm operation. So that is one reservation, that there is no strategy then for the landless, who are the true dispossessed. Secondly, we looked at how the World Bank or AID defines small farmer. Take the case of Nicaragua. We also looked at in other countries, but take Nicaragua. We found there that AID's project defines small farmer as anything less than 112 acres. Now, for any of you with any experience in the third world, 112 acres is not the poor rural class. So this then opens the door to support for really a middle strata of people in the countryside who will then be getting loans through our government, who then will have a stake in the status quo when the status quo for the majority of people is still deteriorating in the countryside. So that is another very basic reservation we have. I would also add that along this line, that the whole definition of development, when I mentioned that AID now uses the term target population, and the World Bank also, one gets the clear sense that development is defined by such agencies as something that is first of all done to people, and secondly that is often associated with the supply of a given good, whether that be an irrigation system, whether that be a new plow or a new seed. That development is equated with a supply of something. That thing often supplied, most often supplied, of course, by a U.S. producer. But that may sound rational until one really begins to look and question other approaches to development that define the process very differently. And way to achieve it. That is the development. The development is something that is happening with human beings and is not objects being supplied. However enlightened the rhetoric around that that process is. I would, in this very brief sketch on aid, this kind of detour in my talk, I would also add that it is very, very important when in focusing on aid, well, let me just put it this way. In focusing on aid, it is very easy to forget that the overwhelming impact of the U.S. government is not through its official government development assistance programs. That there are many ways that the U.S. government relates. One of them is through our military assistance. One of them is through the U.S. government's support for multinational agribusiness in the third world. It is through support for World International Monetary Fund and our votes there that determine whether or not a government is going to get this or that support through the International Monetary Fund. It is in many of these ways that are invisible to the public eye that often have the biggest impact on a third world country, much more than a project funneled through the Agency for International Development. So what I'm suggesting then is that we must always keep the Agency for International Development very, very much in perspective of the overriding other ways that U.S. government influences and directly determines then, helps to determine, I wouldn't say that we are determining, helps to determine who eats. So in this detour, I would stop there. I will come back to these themes at the very end of my talk. But I wanted to go on to the third basic myth. And this is one that I think probably many of you don't hold, but I think it's worth talking about because so many Americans do. And that is the idea that hunger is a contest between the hungry people in the third world and the people in the industrial countries. And somehow moves like the New International Economic Order, for example, often get interpreted to Americans as, well, if they step forward, then we must step back, that any progress by a third world country means that we have to tighten our belts, that we have to give up something. And in that kind of scenario, then average people in the third world become the enemies of people in the industrial countries, enemies in the sense of a contest. And, or either that or they become a tremendous burden. That's another way, of course, that them versus us, that they're a burden on our shoulders. And in our work, what we try to do is to break through both of those, the burden and the threat stereotype of the third world, and communicate that, in fact, we are allies with the very hungry people we are made to fear. And how do we see that alliance? How do we understand that? And what we do is to try to point out what some of the parallels are between the plight of people here in our own country, even though we do have a much, much greater standard of living, but we also, there are very real parallels in the increasing powerlessness that we are made to feel here in the United States. So parallels on the one hand, and on the other, the interconnections. How are we connected? Through what mechanisms in our economic system are we connected to the plight of hungry people? So let me just draw out first the parallels. And I think they're quite startling, actually. I already mentioned that in the third world, a study of 83 countries showed that 3% of the landholders controlled about 80% of the land. Well, in our own country, that figure is about 5.5% of the farms control now over 50% of the farm land. If we look at cash receipts in the farm sector, in agriculture, what we find is that the top 20% of the farms in the United States account for about 80% of all the cash, receipts from farming in this country, whereas the bottom 70% receive 11%. So that you see a very dramatic concentration of reward at the top end of our farming sector in this country, and that this is, of course, increasing. We find here also growing tendency in our own country. In the sense that in the United States today, it's estimated that over 50% of our farmland is operated by non-owners. This is something that I think would shock many Americans, perhaps not people from a farm area who are more familiar with farm statistics, but I think that most people think of U.S. farms as all owner-operated. So that is 50%. We find a similar role of technology in our own country from throughout this century and before. The role of technology, essentially, as the Time magazine headline said a few weeks ago, you either get big or get out. That was the headline in the Time magazine article. And it went on to say that this was a very progressive phenomenon in the United States, that there was this shakedown process in farming that they said was a good thing in the 1970s because it weeded out the inefficient farmers. And in our research, we would say that it is not that the farmers that are left are the more efficient ones. We would say that there is a phenomenon which is fairly easy to document, that once you are at a certain size and have access to credit, you are going to be weather out the fluctuations in the international market in a way that a smaller farmer could not. And it's not because you're necessarily a better manager. But that this role of technology has been very powerful in this process of shakedown. One of the more dramatic statistics I've run across recently is in tomato production in California. As recently as 10 years ago, there were about 6,000 major tomato growers in California. After the introduction of a great deal of mechanization in the field, presently there are about 800 growers that produce about 80% of all tomatoes in the United States, and they are these California growers that have been able to take advantage of the new technology. So it is a very similar process then of those who can afford the new technology. And many of you are aware, I'm sure, that in only a 10-year period that the price of machinery for U.S. agriculture needs has tripled, farmland has doubled in cost in only a 5-year period. The farmer in the United States is faced with a very similar squeeze as a third world farmer is faced. The fact that a farmer in the United States only gets a third of every consumer dollar that is spent for food at best, and it's estimated that 75 to 80% of that could be going out just to maintain, just to pay for the costs of production itself. So this squeeze, this cost squeeze is very similar to what a small farmer in the third world would experience. Another phenomenon which is parallel, certainly parallel to say what I saw in rural Philippines in summer of '77, is foreign investment now moving into the United States. It's estimated that in U.S. agriculture, $1 billion was invested in 1977 from foreign sources. Of course, there is no mechanism really to monitor this investment, but this is from highly reliable real estate sources that were quoted in U.S. government publications, $1 billion worth of foreign investment. Another parallel is that we are increasingly becoming an export agriculture country. In other words, U.S. farmers are made to believe that they have to keep exporting more and more food in order to survive, and are put at the mercy of the fluctuations of this international market. This is very similar to what is a very endemic reality of underdevelopment for third world farmers, of being at the mercy of exports in order to survive. Another similarity, ironically, is that we are also becoming a major food importer. It's estimated that for every dollar we earn exporting food, we spend a dollar importing food. This is USDA figures. Now, many of these, as much as 1/2 to 2/3 of these, depending on what year you're looking at, are products that could and have been grown here in the United States and are directly competing, therefore, with U.S. producers. So these are some of the ways that one can see a very similar anti-democratic, we would call it, anti-democratic process of increasing concentration of the food system, very similar to that anti-democratic reality that causes hunger in the third world, where you have a tiny elite that controls resources and the rest of the people are working for that with very little control. I just read a fascinating article, talking about small farmers being out of control. Remember, I just mentioned these tomato growers in California, these top 800 who were left. Well, you would think that they would have a lot of power because they were the top dogs who remained in the business. Well, I just read a very interesting article about a suit being brought by one of these tomato growers who claims that he and the Association of Tomato Growers Association in California are unable to withstand the price-fixing mechanisms of the canners in California, Del Monte and others there, who collude to set the prices for tomatoes. So if, the ironic thing, of course, is that these tomato growers themselves are quite well-off individuals, and yet you think, well, if they can't withstand the kind of kind of concentration in the food processing industry, what chance does a truly small producer have? So that then leads to the other level of concentration in our food system, which is, of course, much more highly concentrated than the actual farmland control, and that is the marketing and processing of our food. It's estimated that 0.2%, or 50 out of almost 30,000 food firms in marketing and processing and marketing, control well over half the assets of this industry. So it is this is, of course, a much higher degree of concentration than in even control of farmland itself. I want to jump, well, before I do that, I didn't make the final link, and that is to what people eat in this country, the connection then, what is the impact on the consumer? Well, what we found and what people experience in the third world is that food inflation is increasing, is happening at a much more rapid rate than the food index in general. And so that we have, although we are told that we should be thankful for cheap food policy in the United States, the way that people talk about the cheap food is when they use averages. But when you stop using averages and look at what the bottom half of the United States U.S. families have to pay for their food, you realize why people are so upset. And U.S. Census concludes that 1 out of every 10 Americans, 1 out of every 10 must spend almost 70% of their income on food. So that is the final point I wanted to make there. I wanted to move on, though, to the interconnections. These I was trying to just draw out again very schematically. What are the parallels that we can draw between what is happening in U.S. and what is happening in many hungry third world countries? Okay, well, what are the interconnections? Now, I've pointed to the 0.2% of all food firms that are at the pinnacle of our food economy. Well, it is these food firms moving into underdeveloped countries looking for cheap land and labor to grow food to export back to the industrial countries. In other words, as our farm workers begin to organize here, as land costs begin to go up here, the response of these large corporations is to look for a cheaper supply elsewhere. So this is the phenomenon that we call the global farm, serving the global supermarket. And it ties in very much with what I said in the early part of my talk, because what's happening in the third world is an increasing impoverishment, increasing cutting out of people of control, so that there is a stagnant or even sinking domestic market for food. Now, the local producers of food are therefore looking for markets abroad to sell that food to a higher paying market. And that is where the connections start being made, because then the U.S. Multinational firm will go into a joint partnership or a contract relationship with a producer in a third world country who wants to find a market for his production, and then that will then start increasing the imports into countries like the United States. I had a very personal experience with this phenomenon in the Philippines in 1977. I visited many banana plantations in southern Mindanao. And now here's an area that 10 years ago was largely small farmers and tenant farmers growing primarily food crops. And until Del Monte, Dole, and United Brands and one Japanese firm came in to seek out a local producers for banana production so they could ship those bananas to the Japanese market, where the Japanese will pay about 25 cents for one banana. So what happened was that they found a few Filipinos who had enough land, the reliable the local rural elite there, signed contract with these giant multinationals. That then gave the local producers incentive to expand their holdings of land, pushing tenants off the land, pushing what they call the tribal minorities in the Philippines up into the hillsides. These are people who'd been farming this land for many, many years, but didn't have the legal sheet of paper that said it was theirs. And so with the help of the Philippine Constabulary, which is supported, again, by U.S. military assistance, push these people off the land. I mean, it all comes full circle eventually. And so we went in to see what is the reality now in rural Mindanao. We saw 57,000 acres of bananas. This is just in a transformation in this 10-year period. We went into these plantations where these people were offered the better life, right, on the plantation. And we discovered what the better life meant. It meant absolutely no job security because in a Marcos martial law government, there's no organizing, there's no strikes allowed. There's no say over hours. Whenever the fruit is ready, if it means working 12, 14 hours, even longer, until all the fruit that is ripe is packed, you work. People are exposed to very, very hazardous conditions. There are 3 different means in which they're exposed to pesticides, and much of it is blanketed down from airplanes. The water supply is contaminated. We saw people one pregnant woman in particular, I remember, who showed me a large lesion on her leg caused by a spraying of fungicide, accidental in the packing house. So this is what then the global part of what the global supermarket means in a microcosm. Then it's building then on the colonial order of seeing the underdeveloped country as the export platform back to the industrial country, seeking out that cheaper land and labor. Now, is this an advantage to us? I would say that it is not in several ways. First of all, we don't get cheaper food. There's no evidence that food coming to the United States, say tomatoes from Mexico or strawberries from Mexico, are any cheaper that can be produced here. So, first of all, we don't benefit that way. Secondly, our food needs, our very legitimate food needs in this country, are made dependent on a supply route that is, first of all, highly unreliable and very costly in terms of fossil fuels. Third, we are made into a suction force unwittingly, pulling food out of countries where people should be using that land to feed themselves, and therefore we become an additional force to making it profitable to maintain that status quo and shipping that food out. It gives our government further rationale to support that current government in power with various sorts of military and economic assistance, because U.S. agribusiness is in there and has those investments that are backed by the U.S. Treasury. So these are all the ways that I would say that the global supermarket is the kind of interdependence that no one needs. It is a fake, it's a false interdependence that ultimately pits us against the very hungry people that we want to be allied with. I would like to make as my final final organization of my thoughts around the theme of the final myth being that even if people believed or were sympathetic with much of what I had said so far, they would have one basic reservation. I mean, the reason I'm saying this is because I've had this happen before. People say, well, I've read your book and I really like what you're saying, but it's very idealistic, and we have to rely on large agribusiness because they have the know-how and they have the production capacity to feed the world. And, you know, all that Schumacher stuff of small is beautiful, that's really elitist because we can't afford that kind of thinking because we have to feed people and we have to grow that food. And so all this talk about justice and redistribution, well, it's nice, but it's just not practical because we can't take the time to worry about those problems when we have to feed the hungry world. And so I'd like to end with an answer, with the way I would go about anyway, answering those kinds of reactions to this sense of what some of the causes are. The causes, if you haven't gotten so far, have to do with the very anti-democratic control and decision-making about land and food-producing resources. It's in that realm that the problem lies. Well, then the opposite of that would have to be a more democratic control, would have to involve redistribution of land, not only redistribution of land, but organization of producers that protected their own interests. Now, why would such a democratic redistribution lead to greater production? How can you prove that that is a possibility and that is a likelihood? How can you prove it? Well, first of all, we start out by challenging people to look at any third world country and try to find a third world country that has eliminated hunger, that has not first redistributed control, at least in in at least a more democratic fashion than it had before. And we would hold that the only countries in the world that have eliminated fundamental malnutrition as an endemic problem in their country are countries that have undertaken such a sweeping agrarian reform, and where people know, therefore, that their labor will directly benefit them. So that's one way of approaching it, is looking at the historical record, looking at countries and trying to, you see, often people look at countries where you've just redistributed foods and land, such as Cuba, for example, and they hear that there's rationing in Cuba, or rationing, what's another country, say, Mozambique, where I was this summer. And they assume, if they hear about rationing or a bread line or something like this, they naturally assume that there's been a retrogression, that in fact what any redistribution has accomplished is to make people have to stand in bread lines and food have to be rationed. So this is part of the way that this reality is interpreted to us. So when I was in Mozambique, I would say things like, whenever I had a chance to talk to people in agriculture, which is what I was there for, of course, I said, well, you know, in America, we associate countries like yours with bread lines and slogans. We think it all amounts to bread lines and slogans, and what do you think of that? And I got quite a response to that. And what they laid out for me is that, well, Americans may hear about bread lines in Maputo. This is the capital of the newly liberated country of Mozambique. But they don't realize that before liberation of our country, that nobody had bread but the Portuguese, a tiny minority of the country. Said not only did we not have bread, we didn't have carrots, we didn't have vegetables of any kind, we hardly ever had fruit, we had no meat. And I finally, after he went through this long list of things they never had, I said, well, what did you eat? He said, we ate corn. So what he was trying to communicate to me is that very often, and what the bread line, the fact that they do parcel out the bread and give each family a certain amount of that bread because it is very scarce and they've had to import a great deal of wheat. What he tried to point out to me is that we could see that as a backward step, and yet for them it is bringing about justice in a way that they had never experienced it before, and people who had access to food they never had access to before. So in a way that is sort of an aside too. But I just want to point out that what we have to do, therefore, in looking at countries where there is a redistribution of control going on, we have to go beyond regular media sources, or else we will not truly understand the processes and be able to critique them, not to look at them with rose-colored glasses, because believe me, countries like Mozambique have tremendous difficulties to face the colonial heritage and many, many tough trade-offs in their policies that we can get into in question and answer period. But so we have to look, that's one way of suggesting that we look, really examine what has been the impact of redistribution of control historically in countries like China, for example, and how grain production has doubled in a 20-year period since their redistribution. Okay, but there's another way, and that is to look at how what we call in Food First, the inefficiency of inequality. How can we help people to see the built-in inefficiency to an anti-democratic control of the land? And it sometimes it seems like people would see it, and yet it's like something we breathe, so we don't ever think about it. Now, when we went down into northwest Mexico, as I again mentioned earlier, we saw what we came to call in the book the waste of wealth, or later in the book we've called it now the siphoning effect, that when you have a tiny minority who control the land as they do in northwest Mexico, you have the siphoning of the wealth that is produced by the land. Yes, the tremendous wealth produced, but what happens to it? It is siphoned out of productive use in agriculture. And so you could see that. You would go into the cities and you could see the new pickup trucks parked in front of the new banks. We went into the homes of the landlords and saw their velvet tablecloths and their fountains in the front yard, and we realized this is where the wealth produced by the Green Revolution is going. Studies by the Canadian anthropologists have been very useful to us, a woman named Kathleen Goff with 20 years experience in anthropological work in the field. And she has outlined this process of siphoning very, very specifically. And she says that in countries like India, for example, she estimates that approximately half to two-thirds or even three-quarters in some areas of the wealth that is produced by the labor of the people on the land is actually siphoned out of productive use in agriculture to build that land and make it more productive. It is siphoned off instead. It goes into maybe either luxury consumption, as I just mentioned, and maybe go into investment in the taxi fleet in the capital, or into a bar, or into a beauty salon for the foreigners, or it might even go into a foreign investment. So there's that waste of wealth that has to be looked at. The other measure of the inefficiency of inequality is how the unequal control over resources undercuts cooperation and undercuts motivation. If you look at Bangladesh, where 90% of the land is worked in all or in part by non-owners, you realize that there is a fundamental constraint on the motivation that it would take to really use those alluvial soils that I mentioned, or those water resources that I mentioned, some of the richest in the world. But it takes motivation, people knowing that they're going to be on that land next year, people knowing that that labor, that produce that they end up with at the end of the year is going to them and not to their landlord. So that this extreme inequality in control undercuts that basic motivation. It also undercuts the potential for cooperation. And I think in so many countries, particularly in densely populated countries like, well, I would say this would be just as true in another way in scarcely populated countries, but the cooperation. We learned as we studied the history of Bangladesh that prior to British colonialism, that there were many ponds that were maintained for irrigation purposes and for fishing, that now when our staff people go to Bangladesh, they have seen these silted up, and they asked, why are these silted up? And the reason is very clear. It has to do with land tenure. Who controls that? Who will benefit from it? When so many of the people feel they're competing against each other, when the landlords don't want the poor peasant to progress because they will afraid of any growing power, then there's no possibility for cooperative work. People are pitted against each other for survival. So that these ponds then are not maintained, a tremendous source of protein and irrigation are wasted. So this is another measure of the waste of wealth. So these are some of the ways that we can learn to communicate the inefficiency of inequality that perhaps will help people to see that what is the most naive or the most unrealistic is to fail to address those inefficiencies. And even we are often blind as we look at overall land use patterns in the third world, the fact that when a few people control the land, that will inevitably go to the highest paying crop that might be in a market abroad, as I mentioned in the global supermarket phenomenon. So what we find now is that not only are the basic colonial crops and that we've, coffee and cocoa, etc., but also the new luxury items, carnations from Colombia, this sort of crop, but even more so basic food staples like cassava, or sometimes called manioc if you've learned it that way. This now is becoming a big export from a country like Thailand, export to the European market where it's fed to livestock. So this is a final way then, and I just thought of there at the last moment, perhaps the most basic one, if you could, to give people the sweeping sense of how the tight control of agriculture leads to these very irrational uses of land. I mean, I think for anybody's money, it would have to seem very irrational for large tracts of land to be going to feed livestock in Europe when people in Thailand could be using that food to feed themselves. We can get into the whole question of comparative advantage discussing. I'll be glad to talk about that later. I want to conclude now with a simple, I hope, outline of just what does all this mean in terms of what you and I should be doing. And again, it'll be a big sketch, and I would invite you to, for those of you who want to really dig into this, to write to us, feel free to write to us, get on our mailing list, and we'll suggest to you ways to really get hold of these issues yourself. I don't expect you to take my word for them tonight. I would say there are three different ways that all of these these themes that I've suggested tonight, the kinds of approach they suggest to me. One is that our appropriate role is not to go into the third world and try to set things right. The idea that we can go in and solve the problem of hunger for other people. Clearly that is not our role. What we have to recognize is that in every country where people are hungry, there is already initiative by local people. It may be small, it may be weak at this point, but it is happening, and it may be much stronger than we think. I think from my experience in the Philippines, it is much stronger than we are made to believe. People who are organizing in the villages, who are organizing, often risking their lives, to educate people about the forces that are keeping them locked into an exploitative pattern and how they can work together to develop a democratic system. So if that's happening, then if we can assume that people are like us and people are wanting to make their lives better there, then what is our role? Our role is to figure out what obstacles are being built in our name by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government is the way that we most directly impact on their lives. And I would say we have to then look at very carefully the role of military assistance and military sales. We are the major arms vendor. To the Marcos government, for example, arms sales and military assistance has increased 5 times since martial law began in 1972. We have to take responsibility for the fact that Somoza is the tremendous bloodshed, the tremendous suffering that we have read about now in Nicaragua. We have to see the connection between U.S. government policies that help to put the Somoza family into power and maintain them throughout this century. So that is one area. I would point also to the role of U.S. multinational corporations, as I did, in creating this global farm. They are backed directly. Most of these operations are backed by what's called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is a quasi-government agency backed by the U.S. Treasury. This gives them the courage to go into undeveloped countries to then look for export platforms to role of U.S. aid and the World Bank, which we have to take a great deal of responsibility for, since the U.S. government is the largest voting bloc. And I can only there suggest that I can't convince you of these points that I tried to make tonight, because it was just too sketchy, but if we have done research specifically looking at AID projects, at World Bank projects, and I invite you to write to the Institute and get our working paper that is an examination of U.S. aid. So I would say that halting such programs is another way that we can work. So helping to remove the obstacle is certainly one path, obstacles that are built with our tax money and often in our name. But we can also give direct support. I don't want to give you the idea that I think that we can have no direct connection with people who are working in the third world. I think there are a few organizations, very sensitive organizations, that are trying not to go into another country and set things right, but trying to seek out the local indigenous progressive forces and give them support. Sometimes a very small amount of money actually can make a tremendous difference. We know that in Bangladesh, for example, there is a whole rural paramedical, a village-based health group that is working not only this related to health, but working in basic literacy skills of teaching people in these literacy programs about the whole structure of the local economy and how they can organize to begin to change that. It's very difficult work, but it means that we have to take the initiative to seek out forces that are already working in their own countries and let them tell us what they need and not go in and say, you need this program or you need that program. I also think there are countries in the world where we see real evidence of redistribution going on, and yet where there are still real problems of starvation because of disasters. And in this circumstance, I would say that emergency aid can be very significant. So we have to be much, much more selective about who we are supporting. We can't just assume that just sending money abroad is going to reach the poor at all. And in fact, it may be doing exactly the opposite of what we hope, maybe building obstacles. So if I I would just add on that, because it's personally connected with a group of people working with banana workers on these plantations that I mentioned in southern Mindanao. They toured the United States. Recently, some of you saw their slideshow that they put together explaining the realities of multinational investment in their area. And if any of you would like to rent that or buy that slideshow, where it's now being developed, it will be ready in a couple months. If any of you would like to contribute to their work, that is one way I know of that direct funds can be channeled through to an indigenous organizing effort. I would also recommend to you Oxfam as another group that is sensitively trying to reach indigenous progressive groups. I would conclude this talk with the final "what can we do" statement, and that is to say that our work, high on our agenda is our job here in the United States. Very often after people hear the kinds of things that I have to say, they say to me, well, I understand that you said in the 1960s you were desperate, and what makes you any less desperate today? And what makes you go on? And I think that what I want to communicate about what our job here is in the United States is that I really think that we have to really plant our feet for the long haul. And what I mean by that is that we are not going to, as I somehow thought many years ago, change the fundamental sources of the suffering that we see, the hunger in our own country, the alienation in our own country, the deprivation in many, many measures of it in our own country in 10 years, in 20 years. That what I have come to see is that the system that we take for granted here, the idea that we can have a political system that's a democracy when we allow a more and more highly concentrated economic system, the idea that those two things can go hand in hand is something that took a long time to create. It took hundreds of years to get to this point of economic control that we have today. And I don't expect it to change overnight. I don't expect it perhaps in my lifetime. But I would say that what I'm asking you to do tonight is not to simply, and I'm not excluding these things as very legitimate responses to what I'm talking about, but not simply to, say, join a food cooperative so that you can directly support local farmers in your area and directly undercut the monopoly control of the food chain part of our food system. I would say that could be an appropriate response. But what I'm saying, or say join the Nestle boycott, or organize an education or re-education network through your church or school, or all of these things are very appropriate responses as we get to dig into the root causes. But what I'm asking you is to really think, even if I could only reach 10% of you tonight or even less, to really think about how food issues, how agricultural problems and hunger in this country and abroad might give us collectively together a tool for examining every aspect of our life and how it contributes to a truly democratic process of decision making in our economic sphere. That to challenge us to think, can we acquiesce to increasing powerlessness of people in our in our economy, which of course affects every aspect of our lives. And if we cannot, then how can we take responsibility? How can you in your job, whether it be through your union, how can you in your schooling, what profession do you choose? Do you choose a profession which will just maintain the status quo? Or do you choose a profession that will challenge that economic status quo? In our church work, what basic values are we communicating? Are we truly communicating that people have the responsibility and the capacity for self-government, including in our workplaces, and who gets to eat, and how we protect our soil resources? All of these basic questions that require the thinking and working together of people. So it's maybe it's too much to ask anybody who came to a lecture, somebody who wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet, to be able to take, but I'm really asking you to join with me in really asking the very, very biggest questions about how our economic system works and how each of us has to figure out in our own lives, starting where we are, how can we maneuver, how can we challenge each of our decisions in terms of how they will make possible, perhaps not this year, perhaps not next year, the true sense of a democratic control, a humanized economic system. And I would like to close with a quote from a person who I took a great deal of inspiration from in the 1960s. His name is I.F. Stone, and he was one of these people who kept on preaching in his own journal that he wrote by himself virtually. He kept batting away against the war in Vietnam long before it was popular to be against the war. He tried to ask, why are we there and what are we doing there, should we be there? And he was interviewed and said, and the interviewer said, Mr. Stone, what is it that keeps you going? I mean, nobody's listening to you. And he answered this way. He said, well, he said, I look at it like this. If you expect to see the final results of your work, you have simply not asked a big enough question. And I share that with you tonight. I'm joining hands with you, and that is our mutual challenge. Thank you very much.